Carolyn.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
It's great to be here today, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. So today we're going to be talking about language assessment in a remote learning environment. Something that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So this is basically the plan of what we're going to do today. First of all, I'll do a few introductions and talk generally about what's the impact of COVID-19 has been on our educational worlds. Obviously, we all have slightly different experiences, but we all share something very much in common with the impact of COVID. And then we'll see that, have a look at what effects this has had on the world of assessment and online assessment in particular. So we'll start by just having a quick look at what's been happening in the world of standardized and high stakes testing. And then we'll have a look at more of a classroom approach and what we should be doing with our own tests and assessments. Carolyn's going to talk about, moving tests online and the digital first approach, and then a kind of created constructive approach to classroom assessment using online materials. And so we'll have a look at what online assessment means for teachers. Do the old rules of assessment and teaching still apply? Well, we shall see. We'll think about some practical alternative methods of online assessment, some of the things that we need to deal with, some of the challenges and how we can deal with those. And how, at the end of the day, this is all about students. So we'll look at how we can support students and the kind of resources that we can use for those assessments. So today, our aim really is to give you an idea about what's happening in the world of online assessment, to give you some ideas about how to assess online, and importantly, to give you an opportunity to discuss ways of assessing online with us and with other teachers who are joining us today. So the second part of the session will be practical, and it will involve discussion where you will be creating tasks for online assessment, or you'll be creating ideas for tasks. So we'll be putting you in groups and we'll give you a couple of scenarios to think about, and thinking about what would you do in this situation in terms of online assessment. So this is our basic plan for today. So let's start off straight away with part one, which is what is happening to assessment online at the moment. Well, before we get really into it, just to reiterate what Chris was saying in his introduction to us, just to give you a little bit of context about who we are and where Carolyn and I come from. So this is the Assessment Research Group of the British Council. You may recognise one or two people here, perhaps. Professor Barry O'Sullivan is very well known and speaks throughout the world and in Asia especially. So you may have seen him, and if you've ever been to a New Directions conference before, you'll have definitely seen him, and perhaps Dr. Jamie Dunley as well, underneath, who has been very prominent at different conferences. So Carolyn and I, what do we do? Well, we develop British Council tests with the rest of our group. We do research on those tests. We advise on things like educational reform to governments, and we also advise the rest of the British Council on pretty much everything to do with assessment. And I think it's one of the interesting things here, from my point of view, is that everybody you can see on this slide obviously works in assessment, but everybody also has a background in education and a background as teachers. So Professor O'Sullivan has worked in the UK, in Japan, in Peru, in English language teaching. Jamie Dunley has worked in Japan. Dr. Karen Dunn, our statistician, has worked in the UK at university level. I've worked also in the UK and Turkey. Carolyn has worked in Austria and Russia and lots of other places I'm sure she'll tell you about as a teacher and teacher trainer. So we all have, although we deal with assessment, we're all kind of, teachers at heart, and we have teaching, as part of us and what we really believe in. So we're educationalists first and foremost, and not just, I hope, kind of dry assessment people, but I'll let you be the judge of that. So what we believe is that teaching and learning and assessment all go together. And that's something that people often talk about, but it's something that often doesn't happen in practice. So we still have, the student is the whole point of this, and that's who we should keep in mind whenever we're creating assessments or evaluating our learners. It's the learner who's important. So that's us. So while you're here, could you please introduce yourself in the chat area? Could you please just, if you can, say who you are, what you do, what your role is. Are you a teacher, or are you, do you have a different role? And where do you work? So which institution or which town or city do you work in? So I'll just give you a moment to do that. I can't actually see the chat area at the moment. Carolyn, can you see?
Yeah, we've got Pierre Pexon, the education manager at the British Council in the Philippines. We've got a certain Jamie Dunley from ARG, who we've just introduced, and who says hello. That's all we've got at the moment.
Okay. Okay, well, please, if you get the chance over the next few minutes, just to introduce yourself in the chat area. It's good to have everybody here. So let's move on. So that's us. So that's just to give you a bit of context about who we are and what we do. So getting down to remote assessment. Why are we here? How did we get here? Well, we've all been affected by COVID-19. So just here to recap, how this happened and where we got here. Remember that this actually, I was looking this up last week about the timeline over how all this came about. And if you remember, it was actually back in January when the WHO, the World Health Organization, first announced that there was a coronavirus had emerged. And we watched it with interest over the first month or two. And it was actually quite early on in February and March when societies, communities went into lockdown, and also that school closures began. So we've actually been in this situation for quite a long time now. So it's been well over 6 months since lockdowns began. And a lot of people have actually come out of lockdown. So from about May onwards, schools and universities around the world started opening, although obviously that differs in each country. Some came out of lockdown much earlier than others. So we've all had slightly different experiences of how this has impacted upon us. But one thing is sure, and that is, as UNESCO has said, you see that quotation there, they say it's caused the largest disruption of education in history. So the word unprecedented has been used quite a lot for this pandemic, but it really is true. We've never seen anything like this before, and in terms of mass education, something that's affected us so deeply and so quickly. estimated 1.6 billion learners have been affected, and that 94% of students have been affected by closures to schools, education, other education systems, vocational training, not just schools and universities, but any other centres related to education as well. So we are all in this together. So what's happened to us? Well, remote learning has become the new normal. And that's taken on different types, and it's been successful to different degrees. We have synchronous online learning. That's where perhaps you're in a situation like this, where there's a teacher who's talking on Zoom or on Teams or some other platform, talking directly to students in real time. And then there's also asynchronous learning, where people have been working on their own, where students have been given things to do and then are expected to report back to the teacher. So if you think about your own experience, about what the balance between these has been. For example, my son, who's at high school at the moment, has mainly been involved in asynchronous learning. There have been very few live sessions and quite little contact with his teachers. But your experience may have been quite different to that. One good thing that we've seen is some innovation in distance education. So this is not only online materials that have been used, but actually people have been using media like TV and radio, which we shouldn't forget, and also printed materials sent out to people through the post. So there are alternatives to online assessment. Remote assessments and online assessment are not exactly the same thing. But one thing which is clear is that teachers are central to this process. And teachers need adequate training as well, because this is a situation that we haven't been faced with before. So we need to get support from our institutions. So exams have been cancelled, and this has had a big impact on opportunities for students. Another example from the UK, where we are at the moment, high school students, their exams were cancelled, and alternative, they were judged on the basis of course assessment. But there's controversy about the judgments made about the students, and this is having a massive impact on their opportunities, whether they'll be able to go to university or their other employment opportunities as well. So what does this tell us? Well, when we start abandoning our assessments, cancelling our assessments, then we get into trouble. And we cause more problems than we solve sometimes. So here, what do I say? Abandoning assessment is not an option. This is something that we need to do, and it's an obligation that we have to our students especially. So what are the reasons why we need to carry on with assessment? Well, sometimes the government says we have to, or our institution tells us it's an obligation, so we don't have a choice. Students expect us to assess. It's part of the natural rhythms, the routine of teaching and learning. And in a way, it could be quite reassuring for students to have these regular assessments and know that the teacher is following their progress. It helps us also with planning and evaluation of our courses and making sure that we're meeting students' needs. It gives us an opportunity to give feedback to students. It also has a positive washback because we fix expectations in our students. They know what they have to do if they're working towards a test. I'm sure you're all familiar, is that if we set our assessments in the right way, and if they are connected to teaching and learning, then they can have a positive impact on motivation of our students. And they give them a clear goal to work towards. And also, again, looking on a positive side, this has given us an opportunity for new approaches to assessment. So some of the old rules perhaps don't apply anymore. Okay, so what do you think about this? I would like you to go to, I'm going to show you an online tool that you may have used before, called menti.com. So on your telephone, you can go to menti.com and put in this code, 848219, or you can try using this QR code if you have QR feature on your phone. Okay, and I will go to the website. Excuse me a moment. So I'd like to get you to answer the following question. Which of these describes the situation in the place where you work? So what kind of disruption has there been at your institution? Are you, have you started teaching again? Okay, so these are some of the possible scenarios that we're faced with at the moment. Okay, so in lots of places, classes have started again, but it's still quite mixed. Two people there said that teaching and learning taking place online, or that there's a mix between classroom and online learning. Okay, so that's interesting. So this just shows that everybody's experience is slightly different. Okay, I'm trying to move the presentation on. Okay. So you've probably all been involved to some extent with online assessment, or you've been involved with colleagues perhaps who've been doing online assessment. Could you write 2 or 3 words to describe your attitudes or feelings towards online assessment? What has been your experience with assessment online? Okay, so just writing 2 or 3 words, and here we go. And they will come up on the screen. Okay, interesting. So a mix of things there. So reliable, convenient, easy to use, assess at your own pace. Okay, so you quite a positive attitude towards that. Okay, we have got a couple there. Complicated, challenging, perhaps. Yep. But generally, it looks as if we're mostly positive about this. Okay. I've got another question for you. If I can move this on. Okay. So in this one, what methods have you used if you've been involved in online assessment? So have you used exams online, different kinds of tests, any kinds of alternative assessment, perhaps? I think for this one, you can enter several times if you wish. But just give an example of 1 or 2 things that you've used. Okay, so still quite a lot of quizzes, different kinds of tests, practice tests, exercises. So still quite a few things that look like the kind of the traditional tests perhaps that we know. We've also got a few other interesting things there. So open book practice tests, formative assessment, exercises and drills. Okay, interesting. I'd be interested to know how the drills take place online.
Richard, if I could just jump in there. I've
Yeah.
also got a comment in the chat from Damien Dwyer, who also adds video mediated speaking tests, just mock testing that he's been involved in personally, and online writing scripts.
Okay.
So thanks, Damien.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for those. Okay, I've got one or two more questions which I'm going to show you. So what is one method of online assessment that's worked well for you? Sorry, I need to give you a code first. Excuse me. That's my mistake.
The code, Richard, is at the top of the screen, so we can.
Ah, yes. Okay. I was going to show you the QR code, but you could just, yes, you could still use the code at the top. So let me get rid of that. So use the code 8761421. What's one method that's worked well? So just one, maybe out of the ones that you said before. Okay, tasks to complete and submit. A test with a set of MCQs. Okay, that's good. Task sheets. So this is interesting. So this is something that maybe we can talk about later on, which is, you know, so whether you've delivered these electronically through a platform perhaps, or maybe you just sent PDF or Word copies of exercises. I'm curious as to how you've done that. I'm assuming with most of these is that they're actual worksheets, so they're Word documents or PDFs. Okay. So submission of work through a portal. Okay, that's something that lots of people have been doing. Okay, I'll move on to another one. So what's one concern or question that you have about online assessment? Do you feel we've all been using these methods now for quite a while? So we have actually been learning a little bit, I hope, along the way about what works, what doesn't work. So you found some things that work for you in your context. What about some questions that you have? Some things you're not sure about, maybe some things you'd like to try. Some things maybe that you're not comfortable with online assessment, something you'd like to improve, perhaps? Okay. Okay, there seems to be a common theme coming up with this one. So security, academic integrity. Okay, this is something that we are, okay, reliability. So this is something that we're going to be talking about later on in the session because it's extremely important. Okay, the proctoring. Okay, so ensuring standards. Okay, well, we'll try and address these as we go through the session today. And these are issues that we can talk about later on. And when we come to the practical session, we can certainly talk about those. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm going to give you one last question before I let you go. Okay, so do you think things are ever going to be the same again? Do you think that this, what we're going through now is going to have this, hopefully it is going to pass, the pandemic, things are going to get better. So are things going to go back to normal, do you think, or do you think this is going to have a big impact on assessment forever after this? Okay, we've got mainly agreement. Does nobody disagree with this statement? Anybody think, no, it's going to just go back to the same way it was before? Okay, I guess what this means is that online assessment is here with us, here to stay, and that we need to work with online assessment and work out the best way to deal with it. Okay, if everybody who wants to answer has answered, then we will move on. Okay. Okay, it's taking me back to the first slide, so I'll just click through. Okay, so talking about security and online assessment, then what's happened to the big tests? What's happened to standardized testing, the international tests? Well, what we've seen generally is very fast development and a move to online and at-home testing. So there's been big disruption, okay, to the large-scale tests, to things like TOEFL and IELTS and the other major tests, Pearson, Aptis, things like that. Test centres have been closed. Even when test centres are open, sometimes it's been difficult for test takers to get to the test centres because they've been locked down. So this has created a lot of uncertainty because we come to realize how much we actually rely on these tests. So a lot of uncertainty for test users. That means also the people who use the results of the tests, like universities, like employers. So we've had a suspension of testing activities where no testing has taken place at all. We've also had a set of tests which were online before COVID started. So in a way, these tests have had an advantage of being online already. Maybe they've had remote proctoring, remote invigilation of the test already. So they have become, some of those tests have become quite popular. Some of the traditional tests have started to develop at-home versions. So for example, TOEFL and IELTS both introduced versions that could be taken from the test taker's own home. And also we've seen the emergence of alternative methods. So actually things like assessing coursework, looking at different ways of submitting work online. And these have all been potential solutions. So this move to online testing has been mainly through remote invigilation. And there are two methods that this can take. One is an AI solution, so artificial intelligence, where you are monitored. There's a kind of automated monitoring of your behavior while you're taking the test. So your camera is on, your microphone is on, and while you are doing, for example, a reading or listening test, then a camera is watching you, and an algorithm decides whether you are behaving in an appropriate way. So for example, if during the test at any point you disappear off the screen, then the artificial intelligence will flag that up and say, okay, here's some inappropriate behavior, which we have to watch. And what that means is that if that is flagged up, then you may actually be disqualified from the test. So it's quite serious. And also this can, of course, be human invigilation, where there's a real person who is watching you during the test and watching for any signs of inappropriate behavior. And this can take lots of different forms. The balance between the human and the machine monitoring is different for different tests. So the testing has become a little bit more convenient, a little bit more flexible. Either there are fixed sessions which happen quite regularly, so you can take a test maybe once during the week, or it can be on demand, even where you just register for a test and then you can take the test the next day or immediately. However, there's been little impact yet on what the tests look like. So the tests that were already online beforehand haven't changed in their design. And the tests which have moved from paper-based tests to online also look pretty much the same. So the tests themselves, the content is very similar to what it was before. So there's been no impacts of the online testing on the actual, what the test, the skills which are tested and things like that. There are some issues with this. So obviously, if you take an online test, you need a certain set of technological resources. And this can bar access to tests. So some people who don't have, you know, the right computer equipment are barred from the testing, basically. So it can encourage some inequality. But eventually there could be some positive changes. So it could encourage the test boards to have more accessible tests. So people in remote areas will be able to be tested and they won't need to travel. They can do it from home. It'll make it more flexible, like the on-demand testing. And potentially one exciting area for development is that we could start testing more relevant digital communication skills, and recognize that people are communicating online in all kinds of different ways, which are different from the kind of skills that we're used to testing and teaching in the classroom. Okay, so I think at this point, I'm going to hand you over to Carolyn, who's going to give you an idea of what's happening in online assessment. So I'll stop sharing now, Carolyn.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Richard. So I'll just get myself into position here so I can see the screen that you're seeing. So basically what we're going to look at now is a little bit about assessment design, thinking about the number and the types of assessment. So in a classroom environment, it's very easy to give some sort of little test every week, or to have lots and lots of assessments. But obviously in an online environment, it's much more challenging to set those tests up to make sure that everybody is doing them at the same time in the same way and so on. So we can, or we should maybe start to consider, or to maybe reconsider how we assess our students. And one thing to think about is, can I reduce the number of assessments? So if I give lots and lots of little tests, can I change that in some way? Or could I, rather than giving pen and paper tests, can I give quizzes every week? Or can I give different types of assessments? So if you're in a situation where you're very used to giving kind of pen and paper tests, can we do some different assessments, maybe looking, for example, at group work? And this can be done by thinking about the types of assessment we give, that maybe we change from more summative assessments to more formative assessments, or we have different types of tests. As I say, if we're thinking of group work, we could look at doing group projects, group presentations, and so on. When it comes to transferring pen and paper tests online, if we do have to give tests, then we've already seen that security was actually the sort of the biggest issue. So the biggest question there really is, how do I ensure that students are not cheating? So obviously the considerations are, how do I invigilate the students? We've heard from Richard already that this can be done by artificial intelligence, but of course that costs a lot of money. Or we can do it with human invigilation. But as I'm sure you're very aware these days, whether you're using Zoom or Teams frequently, there's a certain number of people that you can have on a screen. So you can't necessarily watch a whole group of 30 students or 50 students or 100 students, depending on how many you have in your class. So that means maybe we have to think about having several test sittings with possibly several different test versions, because obviously if I have a group taking a test in the morning, what will invariably happen if another group is taking the same test in the afternoon is they'll be straight on the phone after the test finding out what was in it, which obviously leads to issues of test security. So those are some of the issues we might need to consider. It might mean having to do a lot more work to prepare lots more test versions. So another way of doing it might be to actually collaborate with colleagues and get them to invigilate your test in exchange for you invigilating their test, which might mean more hours sitting in front of the computer altogether, but less test preparation, because then everybody can take the test at the same time with your colleagues invigilating different groups of people. once we figure that out, we need to think about the technical considerations. And the issue here is, do we give a Word document for students to complete, or do we do an online either quiz or proper test, depending on, you know, what it is we want to teach? Now, obviously, a Word document is the easiest, but how do we do that? How do we deal with timing in terms of when the students have access to the test, if it's actually an online test that you want them all to sit at the same time? How do we know that they will start at the same time and finish at the same time? So timing is an issue. This can be partly addressed with the platform. A lot of VLEs, you may or may not be aware, have sort of timer settings where you can make the assessment available from a certain time to a certain time. Now, that's fine if you've got a reliable platform and you know that students can access it straight away. But sometimes if a lot of people access a platform all at the same time, the platform crashes. So that's something to be aware of. But there are other issues to think about in terms of the platform, such as the technical know-how. Do you know how to set the tests up online? Can you use the same types of tasks that you maybe would use normally? And if you don't have the technical know-how and you don't know how the tasks work, is there anybody there to support you? And what happens if the student's internet connection is not secure? If they have to access a platform at a certain time and they have an issue with the internet or with their computer, how does that impact on what they're going to do? Once you get all of that sorted and you've designed your test and you've got the students answering the questions, then the question is, how will they submit their answers? Do they email them to you? Is there an automatic submission? Again, some types of software will have automatic submissions, others won't. So these are all things that you need to think about. And there are also some pitfalls that you need to be aware of. The biggest pitfall, perhaps, is in terms of test content and the task types. So while we've got certain types of software for quizzes online, if I change my curriculum content to be assessed in a different way, that might have an impact in the classroom. So I need to think about the task types. What effect will it have if I change from a normal, in inverted commas, normal reading test with, for example, comprehension questions, to just a multiple choice grammar and vocabulary test? How will that affect the teaching? If I decide I want to still do a reading test and I've got the technical know-how to put it online, that's great, that's fabulous. But we need to be aware that sometimes things happen beyond our control. And sometimes the layout can change if test takers use a different platform or a different browser to the one that we're expecting. So while it may look perfect on your, for example, Google Chrome, if somebody uses Edge or Firefox, then it may change the layout, and that may have an impact on their performance because they're not getting the same test taker experience. So those are things to think about. If we think about this in a bit more detail, we can talk about the sort of the digital first approach compared to the construct first approach. And what we mean by construct is not to build, to construct as a noun, as a verb, means to build. But here in testing, we talk about construct, meaning the skills or the abilities that we want to test. So do we want to focus first on the technology, or do we want to focus first on the skills and abilities we want to test? And both have their advantages and disadvantages, of course. So if we think about the digital first approach, we can use task types that are easy to use in an online environment, such as multiple choice items or short answer questions where I may give a one-word answer or 2 or 3 words. The advantage of this is that they're quick and easy to construct, relatively speaking, but more importantly, they can be marked automatically by the computer. So that saves us a lot of time, especially if we have very big classes. But the disadvantages may be that they don't test what we want to test. So we may be constrained again by the task types that reduce the types of skills and abilities that we can test. And as a result of that, we may not get all the information that we want about the student. Obviously, if I give my students a grammar or a vocabulary multiple choice test, then I don't know how that compares to their ability to write a text or to speak to me. While there are links between performance on grammar and vocabulary tests compared to abilities in other skills, we can get some information, but we can't get all the information. And what that may also mean is that we spend time in the class teaching them to do well on these grammar and vocabulary tests, and we reduce the amount of time that we spend teaching other things. And this is what we mean by negative washback. So washback is the effect that the test has on teaching. So the health warning when we think about digital first tests is don't let the technology drive what you want to do. Sometimes some of the online tests or some of the software for designing online tests looks very flashy, it looks exciting, it looks different, it looks motivational, and that's great, but don't let that be to the detriment of the actual skills and abilities that you want to teach and test. As with any test, we should be testing what we've taught and not something completely new. And to do all of these, we need to be guided by sound assessment principles. So we'll look at those in a moment. But first, we'll look at construct first approaches. So what we mean here is that, as I say, we focus on what it is we want to test, and that should be testing what we've taught. So the skills that we want to test should be in line with the learning outcomes that are part of the curriculum. The advantages of focusing first on the construct is that some tests, such as receptive skills tests, whether that's a reading or a listening test, can be automatically marked, so that's a good thing. And if we do actually test the skills we want to test, then that gives us better information about the student's ability. Also, the test content then probably reflects better what the students have actually been taught to do in class. So therefore, hopefully our results reflect their ability better again. By testing what we've taught and focusing on how the content can be tested in the online environment, just like in the classroom environment, this can have positive washback. So if we're preparing our tests, our students to write an assessment or a test in which they have to write an email to their friends or write a blog post or write a social media post or maybe write an essay, if that's what we're assessing them on, then that's what we're hopefully preparing them for in the classroom. And these are obviously useful real world tasks where they can show the extent to which they can use the language. The disadvantage of construct first approaches is that the tests are likely to be more difficult to design online because we have to think more about how we're going to design them, especially if we're constrained by certain lengths of answers and so on, or certain types of questions, then that can be quite a challenge. And of course, like with any test that we put online, there may be a need for technical support. So there are positives and negatives to moving our tests online. There are challenges, certainly. But whatever we do, we should be guided by sound assessment principles, as we should be or would be in the classroom. So I've just got 4 sort of fundamental assessment principles here that we need to consider. One is validity, which is testing the abilities that we want to test, making sure that the abilities that we've taught in the classroom are tested in the test, and not something completely different. And that will therefore reflect the student's ability better. Reliability, one of the participants said that reliability was an issue, and this is certainly an issue. When we've got automatically rated tests like receptive skills tests, then we might think, oh yeah, it's all going to be correct and that's all wonderful and I can just ignore it. But actually sometimes something goes wrong. There might be a blip with putting in the answer key. There could be some sort of setting that's not working right with the technology. And so we need to make sure that we go back and check the scores for at least some of the papers, if not all of them. And similarly, again, as you would in the real world, in the non-virtual environment, we need to make sure that marking is reliable. For example, if we're rating a productive skills test, it's always a good idea to have double marking, or at least partial double marking. The next thing is how the test impacts the students and wider stakeholders. So again, if I test something that the students have not practiced, then that's going to have an impact. If they're using tasks that they're not used to, they might not know what sort of answer is required, they might not know how to answer the question, and that will have an impact on the performance. And similarly, the impact of technology can have an effect on their performance as well. We might try to test the constructs we want to test, but what will that do for your teaching? Think about, you would need to make sure that the students are familiar with what the test will look like online. Are they going to be familiar with the software? Will they be familiar with the layout or how to answer the tasks? Will they be familiar, for example, with drag and drop? They should be, they probably are, but they might not be. So all of these things need to be borne in mind when you're preparing your test. And Richard will talk more about this in a little bit. And the last point, which is something that sometimes we forget about as teachers, is that we have to strike a balance. No test really is perfect in terms of time, money, and investment. Whether that's investment in software, computer technology, whatever it may be, or in terms of our investment as teachers to understand how we have to do this. So we have to strike a balance between the time it takes to prepare and mark the assessment with the amount of time we have available as teachers. We're all very busy, we don't have unlimited time, so we need to make sure that we don't spend too much time, for example, trying to work out how to use technology for a 5-minute test. That's kind of a pointless exercise. So if we can think about different ways of doing things, that would be far more sensible. So let's think about what we've been doing and what we can do. Just like Richard, I'll ask you now to go to menti.com and enter this code. So 7787642. And if you just bear with me for a moment, I will pull those questions up. So you should be able to see the question there, and the code is at the top there. So we're not talking now about assessment, we're talking about the actual tasks that you have been doing with your students as part of their classes. So what tasks have your students had to do in their online classes? If you just scribble a couple of answers and post them there, that would be great. Okay, so we've got essay writing as part of the online class. Anybody else? The same as what they would have done in class. Yep, okay. So short answers, reflections, and so on. Multiple choice, fill in the blanks. Okay, good. Open-ended questions. I'm not really teaching online, but I've done mock speaking tests. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's go back again. I'm trying to move to the next question, but it doesn't want to let me, so I'll do it like that. So can you or did you test your students using the same kinds of tasks? So there's quite a mixture of the sorts of things that we might do in the normal classroom there. Did you do those things when it came to assessment? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're seeing that there's a bit of a mixture going on here. So some of the assessments were the same as the tasks that students did, and in some cases not. Any more? Partially, yeah. Any more answers coming in? Okay, let's go to the next one. So for those people that answered partially, how have you been testing or assessing them? What have you been doing that was the same, and what have you been doing that was different? If you could just write a couple of comments about that. I'll assume you're all busy typing away because obviously it will take a little bit longer to write the answer to this one. Okay, we've not had any answers yet. Anybody gonna submit? Yep, okay. Okay, so we've got practice for Speak Up, which is similar to the IELTS speaking test, but with some small procedural differences. So via means that could be more easily submitted online. Okay, good. Changing group work to pair work for ease of discussion, planning of tasks. Yeah, okay. Different expectations and more lenient rubric, question mark. Okay, that's interesting. Spoken on the spot. Okay. Okay, interesting. So we've got quite a bit of a mixture there. And again, we can see that people are already considering how the online environment impacts on the test. I like the comment there about changing group work to pair work for ease of discussion and planning of tasks. That's quite a nice thing that shows that you're thinking about the impact of online work. And different expectations and a more lenient rubric maybe. That's also quite interesting. Okay, let me stop that and go back to the presentation. So at this time, I'm going to ask you to answer in the chat box, and I'll ask Richard if he's there to maybe observe the chat box. And if Richard's gone for a cup of coffee, then I'll maybe ask Chris if he's there. We talk these days about assessment of, for, and as learning. You may have heard of these terms, you may not. But I'd like you to tell me which of the above is summative and which of the above is formative, please, just by scribbling your answers into the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm here, Carolyn. Don't worry.
I see you. I see Chris too as well. It's good to know that you guys are there.
No, we're still here. Okay, we've got one. Louise says, for and as learning is formative. Of learning, summative. Dailin says formative. Another comment, Aisha says for and as is formative, of is summative.
Good.
Yep, another one, the same, formative, for and as learning, summative, assessment of learning.
Okay, good. So we've pretty much got it. That's good. So as many of you have said, assessment of learning is the summative process. And we can kind of think of this as a fairly linear process where we give the content to the students practice the content, and we assess them. And they may or may not get feedback. This sort of assessment is usually done at the end of a course, but it may be done in the middle of a course as well. But if it's done at the end of the course, even if they get feedback, they don't necessarily have an opportunity to improve. So this is where assessment for and as learning come in, with the idea of formative assessment being there to help them improve. And these are much more of a cyclical process whereby input is presented to the students, or the students have input, which they may find out for themselves, depending on how you're teaching it. They practice the input, possibly, and then there's some sort of test or assessment. But the feedback is vitally important here because it feeds into the next steps in their development, which may be planning your teaching lessons, or maybe them moving on to find something that they want to do to improve. And so traditionally, in terms of feedback, we think of a sort of feedback sandwich where we say something positive, then something negative, and we end on a positive. And that's good because it makes people go away with something positive as the last thing that they've heard. So that's the thing that sticks in their brain. The problem with that approach, though, is it doesn't tell them how they can improve. It tells them what they've done wrong, but it doesn't tell them how to improve. So we tend to think of a sort of feedback as feed forward, where we tell them what they've done well, but also what they've done badly, but more importantly, what they need to do to improve. So how they can improve to do things better next time. So that's assessment for learning. The difference with assessment as learning is that that brings in much more of a focus on self-assessment and peer assessment. So it's the students themselves either giving themselves feedback because they can look at a checklist and see whether they've done things right, or they can evaluate to what extent they've understood a concept, or their peers will give them feedback and say X was good, X was not so good, and then they think about how they can move forward and they find materials to help themselves, obviously within the constraints of how we teach them about what they need to be doing. And for example, we could give them checklists to think about what they need to be assessed on, and we could give them a range of materials to look for or to look through to find what they need to do next if they're struggling with something still. So when it comes to assessment, if we can give something sort of formative where the feedback that we give, or the feed forward, if you like, will feed into helping them to improve, then that's key. And obviously that's what we don't necessarily get if we do a test. We might get the answers of this answer is correct, this is wrong, this is correct, this is wrong, so you scored 7 out of 10. But in that case, what happens there is if I don't get the feedback as to why my question was wrong, i.e. what was the right answer and what did I do wrong, if I knew the answers before, that's great, I knew the answers. If I didn't know the answers, I haven't learned anything from that. So that's where this idea of assessment of learning, if I don't get proper feedback, that comes in as I've not got any further. I know I've got 7 out of 10, but I don't know why I got the other 3 wrong, and I don't know how to improve. So these are things to think about when we're designing assessments. That's what I've just spoken about. So we've got some other alternatives that we can do, and some of you have talked about some of these already, which is great. So we can move from individual tests to maybe group work or pair work. We can think about maybe project-based learning and presentations. So students can work together on a project. They can work in breakout rooms, which is what you'll be doing after the break. You work in breakout rooms, work on a project, and your assessment could be the presentation of the project. We can give students task-based learning to do, and task-based learning, if you're familiar with it, can take different approaches. So the tasks that we give the students can be relatively short and simple, or can be much longer, more detailed tasks, such as a project or maybe a longer essay or something like that. The good thing about task-based learning is that it usually integrates the different skills. So it doesn't focus just on reading or just on speaking, but it integrates usually across at least 2 skills and sometimes across all 4. As a result of that, it focuses more on real life communication and real life interaction rather than just one skill at a time. Another option for a sort of assessment, which again you could do, but you'd have to practice it first, obviously, is that students lead a class. And again, they could do this individually or in pairs or in groups. They choose a topic and they are responsible for the content of the class, obviously within the guidelines that you set them. So you might say they have to bring in one sort of reading input, or they have to bring in a video, or they can choose some sort of input, but they have to have some input, and they have to maybe ask some comprehension questions, and they have to design a follow-up task. That could be a writing task or a speaking task. So as the teacher, you're guiding them, you're giving them, if you like, the learning outcomes that the students have to achieve, but they, as individuals or as pairs or groups, decide on the content and develop the class. Another way of assessing students, which works again both online and offline, is to use portfolios where students complete a number of tasks and they either submit the ones that they think they've done best, or they submit a number of tasks through the semester that are all marked, and then at the end of the semester, to count as their final grade, they submit the ones, say the best 5, that they think they've done best on, or where they've scored most highly. That's one option where they have a lot of different small tasks. Another option for a portfolio is that they're working towards one big task, but with interim submissions, if you like. So if you think of an academic essay, which might be quite a long essay, maybe several thousand words, they could submit an essay plan and get feedback on that. They could submit an essay draft and get feedback on that. And then they work towards the final submission of the essay, which is the thing then that is assessed. But they submit various materials along the way. As I say, the essay plan, the essay draft. They may also submit some materials such as references that they've found, or an annotated bibliography. But it's the final version of the essay that is assessed. If you do have to do some sort of test, though, or task, one way to avoid cheating, which we saw was the main issue that people are afraid of, is to give an open book exam. So where we're actually encouraging them to take notes into the test to help them. And one example of that that I worked with a colleague of Richard's on several years ago, a gentleman called Peter Holt, is the open book exam. And Richard and Peter worked together on this in Turkey. And in this case, what happens is that students are basically taught how to write an academic essay, but they do it by giving a number of texts to the students, and they work through those texts in class, and they write a practice essay on those texts. And then for the assessment, they get a new set of texts. They work through the texts for comprehension in class, but they take those texts into the exam, and only then do they get the essay question, and then they write the essay answer in the exam using the texts that they've worked through as references. So we can do open book tasks where we're encouraging people to take notes in to help them. And now I'm going to hand back to Richard, because if you do have to do online tests, there are some aspects to consider.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn. Yes, I'll go through a few things fairly quickly. So what do you need to do? If you're giving online tests, it's easy to forget that support for students is not available. So we need to give our students extra support before they do the test and while they're doing it as well. So We need to give them practice tests as we would do in class. This is something that we need to do to make them familiar with the format of the test, but always remember that this is not a substitute for actual teaching. So the test shouldn't be part of the teaching program. Its purpose is just to familiarize students with the test. Pre-test checks, so make sure that students are comfortable. Remember that they are all in a different environment. They're at home, and that home environment could be somewhere which is very comfortable and very suitable for doing a test in. They could have their own desk and workspace, or they could be in the kitchen with people walking around behind them. So you have to bear that in mind, that they're all in a different place and that you need to deal with any issues that might come up, help them to avoid distractions, help them to concentrate on what they're doing. And during the test, well, you need to be there for technical support in case they have any issues, in case you're watching them on a camera and the camera turns off, in case their internet breaks down. Do you have any alternative means of contacting them? So you may be doing it on a platform like through Teams or Zoom, like we're on today, or it may be through WhatsApp or SMS, short messaging, where you set up a network with your class beforehand so that they can report any problems that they have, or anything that may stop them from doing the test properly. So in general, I mean, for online assessment and learning, as I say, we need to create a community for our class. So we need to help them to speak to each other and to us for more pastoral support, I suppose, non-academic interaction, non-academic support, because they are all at home. As I said, they all have different experiences, and they need to be able to share those sometimes. And they're on their own. As I say, it can be lonely in the virtual classroom. They're on their own, and it's important that they feel some kind of togetherness with their classmates and some connection with you as a teacher as well. And it helps us as well if we keep the communication channels open to set expectations about when work should be handed in, our expectations of academic honesty and preventing cheating, and of course, appropriate online behavior. If students are interacting with each other online, then they need to follow a certain set of rules and make sure that they're, basically behaving respectfully to each other and to you as well. And also we need to keep contact with students, because we need to follow their progress, of course. So we need to involve students in making their own study plans, in up to a point the course syllabus and how that's applied. Get feedback from students, so find out what works and what doesn't. Review plans regularly, change them if necessary. And of course, all of this requires an even higher level of learner independence than we might normally expect during classes. So it helps to have sessions which are specifically about learner independence and about what your students can do when they're on their own. So set them tasks which help them to increase their independence. And of course, we shouldn't forget teachers. Teachers are human as well. So teachers also need to share things. So we always, Carolyn and I always encourage teachers to work together on assessment, because it can be quite a time-consuming job. It needs a lot of expertise, a lot of materials, and it's best done together. So if you create a test, just like you would ask your colleagues to give feedback on it, then it's good with online assessment to work together with your colleagues as well. So you can share ideas about things you're doing, things that work. Share materials. So you found something that has worked in your class. Okay, pass it on and ask other teachers to do the same with you. Share expertise. Maybe one of you is very good at coming up with tasks. Maybe one of you is very good with technology. So put all that expertise together and give people different roles according to what their strengths are. Of course, we shouldn't forget when we're marking things that standardization is important. And that's something maybe that our institutions might not give explicit training on. So that is something that we are going to have to look at ourselves. So we need to work with colleagues, get sample pieces of work, look at them together and agree on how they should be marked and what criteria we're going to use to mark them. And also, of course, teachers get lonely as well. So they need to talk to each other. They need support in order to be able to support students. So these are all important things. They're not particularly complex things, but they're things that can be forgotten. So the big question that we had earlier on was, what should we do about academic honesty and dishonesty? How can we stop the students from cheating? How can we stop them from stealing from each other, stealing from the internet? Well, there are lots of things that we can do. Okay, so here we have a student who's doing an aptitude test at a British Council centre. So how would we keep this student honest? Well, DIY remote invigilation is one thing we can do. So we can watch them basically over a camera, on Zoom, on Teams, on another platform that you might use. Carolyn has talked about some of these things here, so I won't go into detail. We have to think about, if you're giving a test situation, a test event, then you need to think about how many students you can watch at the same time. And if you need to limit the numbers, then you need to have multiple test sessions or involve your colleagues. And this is an issue because the more test sessions you have, the more test versions you will need. And also, the more chance that something can go wrong with technology, in that somebody's internet cuts out, or some other technical issue might happen. And you've got to think about, well, do I have a suitable platform? Is it going to work? Does my institution have it? Do I have to pay for it? If I have to pay for it, is it worth it? The support system we talked about before with students, about technical issues, technical support. Also, especially if you're teaching at school with children, then could there be, if you're watching someone, apart from the psychological effects on the person who's being watched, which we have to bear in mind, is also that there could be some privacy issues. You are actually, if you're doing this, then you're watching people in their own homes. And that certainly has data protection issues, where if you record any of those sessions, then you would need to delete them almost immediately. And how do you know, again, that it's really secure? So how do you know that your students are not texting each other the answers or copying things from the internet? Well, unless you have a super secure professional system, then you can't really be sure. So what can we do? Well, this goes back to what Carolyn was talking about, changing the assessment program. There are alternative solutions. We can reduce the number of summative assessments, and we can avoid some of these test type events. So maybe they're necessary sometimes, but do we need to have them as a regular thing? Maybe not. Instead, we can use, one thing we can do is use a more process-oriented approach. So Carolyn talked about projects or tasks with multiple stages. So for example, if you're writing an essay, then there might be multiple drafts or versions of that essay. This would involve regular checks from you as a teacher. It may involve peer assessment and self-assessment, and it may involve short, perhaps online tutorials with your students. If your student is copying things from somewhere else, or you have students who are taking things from each other, then if you are part of that process, then you are going to know. It will be quite obvious to you that this is not the student's work. Another thing we can do is adapt the task design. So instead of thinking that students are copying from each other or working together, colluding, or that they are copying things from the internet, then why not make that part of the task? So collaborative work, get students to work together on a project. Research tasks or action-oriented tasks where they go out, they look for things, they do things and report back on them. Where they have to go to the internet to get information. So if you think that this is cheating or academic dishonesty, a lack of academic integrity, then make that part of the learning. So design tasks where cheating is not really an issue. If they're cheating, or our idea of cheating, then that means they're actually learning something, and it's just part of the learning process. If you want to set expectations of honesty with your students, one thing that some people use, and I've used them as well in the past, is honor codes, where you get students to actually write a statement saying, I will ensure that all the work I submit to you is my own work and I haven't taken it from anybody else. And you could get students to sign those. Evidence shows that they do actually work. You might not think that just a promise that you get the student to write would help them to behave with more integrity, but it does tend to improve things. It doesn't eliminate all dishonest behavior, but it does reduce it. And if you really have to, especially if people are submitting written work, then you can use plagiarism software like Turnitin and things like that, or even Google if you want to find out whether people are copying from the internet, then there are ways that you can do it. But we hope to kind of prevent most of these things. Okay, so that's things we can do about cheating. Obviously, it's very difficult to prevent cheating 100% in an online environment because we can't see the students' environment as clearly. We don't have as much control over what they're doing. But then bear in mind that also, you know, we have cases of academic dishonesty in a normal classroom as well, or whenever we ask students to do things online as part of their classroom assessment. So we shouldn't perhaps assume that students are being dishonest a lot of the time. So what resources can we use? Carolyn, would you like to talk about these?
Yeah, okay. So just before we have a break, I've just put up a slide here with some other resources. You may or may not be familiar with these, but obviously the more you can use, the more variety it brings into your classroom in terms of your classes, but also in the assessments. So Mentimeter you're already familiar with because you've been using it this morning. It's where we can provide real-time responses to questions. Another software that you might be interested in is Quizlet, where you can use flashcards, and obviously the students can do that on their own or in pairs or groups or with you leading it. One thing that students may like to do for other groups is a Kahoot, and a Kahoot is basically an online quiz or a trivia game. It's only free for 10 players, so you could get students to do quizzes for each other or for themselves. But if you go above 10 players, then you do have to start paying for it. It's $4 a month for 20 players, and then it gets more expensive. But within small groups, it is free, and it's something that it might work. You may be familiar with Moodle. Some of you may have Moodle as your virtual learning environment, but if you don't, then it's very straightforward. It's a virtual learning environment where you can store files for students. You can have online discussion for, you can set up quizzes in Moodle so that they do little tests. So it's worth looking at. It's quite a good piece of software, and it's free. If you're bored to tears already with PowerPoint, or if your students are bored to tears with PowerPoint, then they might want to do something a little bit different, which is using Prezi. Prezi is an interactive presentation software. It's just something a little bit different. And if you do want to give little quizzes, whether those are going to be formative or summative, that's up to you, but you can use hot potatoes to design those tasks. And with this software, you can do short answer questions, you can do jumbled sentences, you can do crosswords, which is something that you might want to just do sort of as a little thing at the end of a class or something. So that's quite a useful piece of software. Going back to the project work that we talked about, you may want to get your students to design their own website as the output for a task. And they can do that very simply using WordPress. So you might give them a project to research something and to design the website where they can put pictures and videos and text and so on. Or you might want to get them to present their findings, their research project in terms of an online notice board, which they can do with either Linoit or Padlet. You may be familiar with these things. Both of these work as an online notice board. So in the same way as you would have a notice board in the corridor of a physical classroom, or outside a physical classroom rather, we as teachers can hang notices on there. The students can hang notices on there. They can post comments. They can have a conversation, a written conversation on there. But they can also post other things like video, photos, and so on. So you can actually use it as a way of allowing them to have a very interactive presentation of their work. So we're going to leave it there. After the break, we're going to have a practical session, and we'll be getting you guys to work in small groups and use Linoit. We'll introduce that to you afterwards, and we'll tell you what you're going to do. But we would like to give you a 10-minute break now. So it's 9:38 with my watch. So should we say back ready to start at 9:50? Does that work, Richard, Chris?
Yep, that sounds good.
Yep. Okay, so feel free to enjoy your break.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Carolyn and Richard, and we look forward to part 2 at 9:50. Oh, well, 9:50 our time, I should say. I think it's 4:50 Singapore time.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Sorry, 12 minutes from now for those people in Singapore.
Thanks, everyone. Speak to you in 12 minutes. Actually, Richard and Carolyn, I'll manually assign the breakout rooms, I think, because we've got the numbers for it. So I'll just do that actually now in the break. And I think what it means is that once we close one room, I'll then have to manually assign for the next part, which is fine. So you're both okay with the manual assign option?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Right. I'll start doing that now.
Thank you very much. I'll be right back. I'm just going to grab a drink.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, coffee time for everyone. I think for other participants, it's probably better they just stay online and just kind of stay on mute and everything, and then we'll come back very shortly.